The Galactic Council judged humanity weak. They regretted it in 24 hours. The chamber at Vela Station had no windows. This was intentional. The architects of the Galactic Accord had understood, centuries before humans ever left their solar system, that diplomacy conducted under open sky invited sentiment. Sentiment, they believed, was the enemy of policy. And so the deliberation room sat at the geometric center of the station, a pressurized sphere of burnished composite alloy, sealed from starlight, insulated from the cold comfort of the void. Whatever decisions were made here, they would be made without the distraction of beauty. Councillor Sathvareen of the Thar Collective was the first to speak after the preliminary reports were read into the record. She was old even by Thar standards. Her bioluminescent gill plates had dimmed to a pale amber that signaled something close to exhaustion, though she would never have used that word herself. She spread 3 of her 6 manipulation appendages flat on the table surface, the Thar gesture for settled conviction. The physiological survey is conclusive, she said. The human species operates on a chemical cortisol-adrenaline stress response that is, by any measurable metric, primitive. Their threat detection systems are calibrated for predators that have been extinct for 12,000 of their years. Their memory consolidation degrades under pressure. Their social bonding mechanisms dissolve under sustained resource scarcity. They are, at the biological level, a species still fighting the environment that made them. There were 7 council members present. The vote required a supermajority of 5. The motion on the floor was simple in its language and devastating in its scope, that humanity be classified as a Category 3 civilization, capable of spaceflight, but fundamentally unsuited to full Accord membership. That they be quarantined from the inner transit corridors. That their application for co-governance of the Kepler relay be formally denied. That, in the Council's considered judgment, they be left alone to manage their own small corner of the galaxy, for their benefit and, more urgently, for everyone else's. Ambassador Rin Vesquez Okafor heard all of this from the observation anteroom, separated from the chamber floor by a 3-centimeter panel of transparent composite that the station's designers had apparently considered sufficient. She was the only human being on Vela Station. She had been permitted to observe, a courtesy, Councillor Sathvareen had explained, extended in recognition of the 14-month journey she had made to reach this place. Vasquez Okafor was 47 years old. She had been a xenolinguist before she was an ambassador, and before that she had spent 6 years as a trauma surgeon in the aftermath of the Jakarta seismic events, and before that she had grown up in a floating neighborhood in what used to be coastal Lagos, watching her grandmother rebuild the same storm wall 3 times in 10 years. She was, by almost any measure, an ordinary human being, and she knew it. She also knew something the Council had apparently not accounted for. She had spent 8 of the past 14 months reviewing every piece of testimony, behavioral study and third-party analysis the Accord had ever compiled on human psychology. They had gotten some things right. The cortisol data was accurate. The social dissolution under scarcity had historical basis. The calibration lag on threat detection, the way humans continued to startle at shadows long after the shadows had been explained, that was real too. What they had missed was harder to quantify. It was there in the data if you knew what you were reading. But it required a particular kind of imagination to understand why a species with all those fragilities had still, somehow, arrived at Vela Station at all. The vote proceeded methodically. Councillor Methorin of the Siluan technocracy cast the first ballot in favor of the motion. The pellucid chorus, speaking through a single translated voice for its 12,000-member distributed consciousness, abstained. The REM delegate, a towering bilateral mammal named Gorak Sol, voted against, the first dissenting voice. His reasoning was recorded as, insufficient observation period. It was, Vasquez Okafor thought, the most diplomatic way she had ever heard anyone say, "You are making this up." The fourth ballot brought the motion to 3 in favor, 1 against, 1 abstention. 2 votes remained. The chamber air recyclers hummed at their precise frequency. Someone's translation implant clicked softly. Vasquez Okafor pressed one hand flat against the composite panel and watched the councillors prepare to decide the shape of the next century, for 8 billion people who didn't know this room existed. She had asked when she arrived whether she would be permitted to speak. The answer had been politely, firmly, and with genuine regret declined. The Accord's procedural charter was ancient and explicit. The species under review could observe deliberation, but could not participate in it. This was to prevent emotional contamination of the process. She had accepted this. She had not, however, accepted being unprepared. In the pocket of her formal jacket, the dark blue one she had worn for every significant meeting of the past 3 years, the one with a small burn mark on the cuff from the night a cooking fire had gotten out of hand at the Ganymede Diplomatic Training Facility. She had a folded piece of paper. Real paper, pressed from recycled fiber, handwritten with a stylus. Old technology. Deliberately so. She had calculated that anything transmitted electronically could be intercepted or delayed. Paper could not be jammed. The paper contained a single request, written in the Accord's formal trade language. It was addressed to Gorak Sol of the REM, who was the only delegate who had voted against, who had spent 40 minutes in a corridor conversation with her 3 days prior, and who had, almost certainly not by accident, sat down near the anteroom panel rather than at the far end of the chamber where his designated seat was marked. The request was, 24 hours. That is all I am asking for. Give us 24 hours and let what happens in that time be part of the record. She didn't know if he could get it. She didn't know if the council would agree even if he moved for it. But Rin Vasquez Okafor had spent her life in situations that seemed, on paper, already decided, and she had developed a precise and useful understanding of the difference between a decision that had been made and a decision that was about to be made. The 5th ballot was cast. The chamber recorder announced, 4 in favor. 1 vote remained. Gorak Sol of the REM moved for a review adjournment at 14:07 station time, invoking Section 9, Clause 4 of the Accord's procedural charter, the right of any dissenting delegate to request a bounded period of continued observation before a final vote was recorded. The clause had been used 11 times in the Accord's history. 7 of those occasions had resulted in no change to the eventual outcome. 3 had changed votes. 1 had resulted in the motion being tabled indefinitely, which was widely regarded as a category of its own. The request was for 24 station hours. Sathvareen objected on the grounds that additional observation was unlikely to produce materially different data given the volume of existing research. The Pellucid Chorus, which had abstained on the main motion, found the procedural argument interesting enough to vote in favor of the adjournment, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of something else. The motion passed, narrowly, and the chamber recorder announced that deliberation would resume at 14:07 the following day. Vasquez Okafor received word of this through the anteroom's communication panel. The message was a single sentence from the station's protocol officer, stripped of any editorial comment. Adjournment granted per Section 9.4. Observation period, 24 hours commencing now. She stood there for a moment and breathed. Then she went back to her quarters, which were a modest 2-room allocation near the station's mid-ring, and she opened her communication array, and she did the only thing she had ever actually planned to do with this time. She sent a message home. Not to the UN Diplomatic Bureau. Not to the Secretary General's office or the Interstellar Affairs Directorate or any of the 17 committees that had been monitoring this proceeding from a distance of 4.3 light-years. She sent it to her sister Adiz, who was an engineer on the Ceres orbital platform and who had been, for the past 14 months, the only person Vasquez Okafor had spoken to about anything that wasn't the mission. The message said, "We have 1 day. I've done everything I can from this end. The rest is going to have to come from where you are. Tell me what's happening. This requires some explanation." Vasquez Okafor had not, when she left Earth, been operating without a plan. She had been operating with a plan that depended on the Council doing exactly what they had done, issuing a preliminary verdict, and on having at least a small window of time before that verdict became final. She had communicated the outline of this plan to a small number of people before departing. She had not told the Directorate because the Directorate would have found it irregular. She had told Adiz, because Adiz was the only person she trusted to understand that irregular and wrong were not the same thing. The plan was simple in structure and staggering in the coordination it required. It rested on a single premise that Vasquez Okafor had arrived at after years of reading xenosociological literature and then reading the Council's own files on human civilization. The Accord had studied humanity exhaustively in crisis. They had catalogued disasters, conflicts, resource wars, epidemiological failures, governmental collapses. They had enormous quantities of data on what humans did when things broke down. What they had almost no data on was what humans did immediately after. Because the after was hard to observe cleanly. It was messy and slow and interpersonal and distributed. It didn't compress into summary reports. It happened in hospitals at 3 a.m. and in community centers that had lost their funding and in classrooms where the teacher was also feeding children breakfast because the cafeteria had been closed by the district budget. It happened in the structural engineering decisions made by people who had survived one flood and were quietly, without being asked, designing the next seawall to be stronger than any flood they had personally experienced. The Accord had read human history as a record of what humans collapsed into. Vasquez Okafor had spent her career living inside evidence of what humans built back. She needed the council to see the difference. And she had 24 hours. Adi's response came back in 11 minutes, 4 light minutes of signal travel each way, plus 3 minutes for her to read and reply, which suggested she had been awake and waiting, which meant she already knew. The message said, "It's already moving." The Lagos-Mumbai Infrastructure Consortium closed the bridge loan 2 hours ago. The Jakarta Coral Seeding Project reported successful substrate bonding this morning, first time in 6 attempts. The Mars Atmospheric Team submitted their 50-year projection to peer review at 0600 and it's already been cited 14 times. I don't know if any of this matters to them. But it happened today. Vasquez Okafor read this 3 times. Then she pulled up the data feed she had access to through the station's diplomatic information network, a filtered but reasonably comprehensive view of human origin transmissions, and she began compiling. She was not looking for dramatic events. She was looking for ordinary ones because ordinary was the point. The council had built its case on catastrophe. She was building a counter-argument from the texture of an average day, what humans chose without being watched, without a tribunal to impress, when they woke up and decided what to do with the hours in front of them. She was aware, a strange kind of evidence. It didn't fit the Accord's standard evidentiary formats. It had no statistical summary, no comparative index, no normalized behavioral coefficient. It was just, here is what happened today on a planet and in the small outposts around it where 8 billion people were living their lives, mostly without anyone taking note of whether the lives were being lived well. She had 14 hours of compilation time before she would need to sleep. She intended to use all of them. In the chamber, meanwhile, Gorak Sol had stayed behind after the other delegates filed out. He sat at the long table in the sealed, windowless room, and he reviewed, one more time, the behavioral file on the human ambassador. He had reviewed it before the observation period began. He was reviewing it again now, not because it had changed but because he was a thorough individual, and because something in it had been bothering him since he first read it, and he had just figured out what it was. The file noted, in a section on stress response behaviors, that Ambassador Vasquez Okafor had a documented habit of solving problems by preparing for outcomes she didn't believe would happen. She carried backup equipment she expected never to need. She learned languages she had no scheduled reason to speak. She had, during her medical training, memorized treatment protocols for injuries she had never encountered in 30 years of practice, just in case. The Accord's analysts had flagged this as evidence of anxiety-driven over-preparation, a symptom of the cortisol dysregulation Counselor Sathvareen had cited in her opening remarks. Gorak Sol stared at that annotation for a long time. Then he closed the file and sat in the quiet room, and thought about all the species he had known in 50 years of council service, and how many of them had arrived at Vela Station prepared for things that hadn't happened yet. Not many. Not many at all. Why the 8th hour, Vasquez Okafor had stopped sleeping. This was not entirely intentional. She had lain down twice and twice found the ceiling of her quarters more interesting than unconsciousness, and she had decided, with the pragmatic rationality of someone who had worked 36-hour shifts in emergency medicine, that 8 hours of productive wakefulness was more useful than 8 hours of unsuccessful sleep. She made coffee from the diplomatic packet supply she had brought from Earth, because the station's standard offering tasted like warm mineral water, and she went back to the data feeds. The document she was assembling was unlike anything she had formally submitted in her diplomatic career. It had no executive summary. It had no policy recommendations section. It had no projected outcomes analysis. What it had was 18 sections of approximately equal length, organized not by category but by time of occurrence within the 24-hour window, and each section described in plain language a thing that had happened. The Senegal River Authority had completed the 3rd phase of its cross-border water management agreement, bringing agricultural water allocation to 11,000 farming households who had been on ration supply for 4 years. This had been accomplished through a negotiation process that had, on 4 separate occasions, broken down completely and been restarted by the parties themselves without external pressure. The final agreement had been signed by officials from 6 nations, 2 of whom had been formally at diplomatic odds as recently as 18 months prior. In the Osaka Medical Cooperative, a surgical team had performed the first successful application of a new spinal scaffolding technique to a patient who had been paralyzed for 11 years. The lead surgeon, when asked by a hospital communications officer what she wanted the press release to say, had replied, "Say we'd like to try it again." The technique had been developed over 9 years of iterative failure by a team that had lost its primary funding source twice and rebuilt it both times from smaller grants and one institutional endowment from a retired engineer who had himself been paralyzed and had simply decided to do something about it. The Ganymede Botanical Research Station had published a study on closed-loop ecosystem sustainability in long-duration space habitation. The lead author had been 26 years old when she began the research. She was 34 now. The study contained 31 proposed modifications to existing life support architecture. Of these, 7 had already been independently replicated by other teams who had seen pre-publication drafts, a process that had required no institutional coordination. Researchers had simply read the drafts, become interested, and started working. Vasquez Okafor documented all of this. She documented smaller things too. A school in Montevideo that had converted its flood-damaged basement into a community archive for physical documents, because after 3 floods the teachers had decided that certain things should exist in forms that water could not erase. A fishing collective in the Philippine Sea that had been maintaining a voluntary no-catch zone for 7 years and had recorded, in their own informal surveys, a 40% increase in marine population density within the protected area. An elderly man in Reykjavik who had, in his capacity as a retired civil engineer, submitted an unsolicited and extraordinarily detailed structural analysis of a bridge the city government was proposing to demolish and replace, an analysis that concluded the bridge was sound and the replacement unnecessary, which had caused the city to commission a formal review, which had reached the same conclusion, which had saved the city $400 million in public funds, which the man had immediately written a follow-up letter suggesting be redirected to 3 specific community infrastructure projects he had identified as underfunded. She was aware, working through the feeds, that she was curating. Every compilation was a curation, and she was under no illusion that she was presenting an unselected cross-section of human activity. If she wanted to, she could have assembled an equally long document about everything catastrophic, petty, or self-defeating that had happened in the same 24-hour window, and it would have been no less accurate. The council's existing files could serve that purpose. They had been very thorough. What she was trying to show was not that humans were good. She was trying to show that the council's model of human behavior was incomplete, specifically, that it treated human resilience as an absence of failure rather than as an active, practiced, institutionally embedded capacity that humans had developed precisely because they failed so often and had learned, over millennia, to build failure into the architecture of their recovery systems. The section she spent the most time on was the last one. It was the hardest to explain and she knew it. It was about a 12-person team in the Atacama Desert who were running a project called the Long Archive, an effort to create a physical repository of foundational human knowledge designed to remain readable and recoverable for 10,000 years. The project had no government sponsor. It was funded through a consortium of private and institutional donors. Its timeline extended, in its current plan, well beyond the lifetime of everyone currently working on it. The project lead, a materials scientist named Dr. Yusuf Anderson, had given an interview 3 days prior, before any of this, before Vela Station, before the vote, in which he had been asked why he had dedicated 20 years of his career to a project he would not live to see completed. His answer had been, because someone will. Vasquez Okafor had read that interview before she left Earth. She had thought about it, on and off, for 14 months of transit. She thought the council would find it baffling, this devotion of finite resources and irreplaceable time to outcomes that the individual doing the work would never personally benefit from. She thought Sathvarine would call it irrational. She thought the Pellucid Chorus, which experienced time collectively rather than individually, might not have a reference frame for it at all. She included it anyway because the document was not, ultimately, designed to be comfortable. It was designed to be true. At 6:14 station time, approximately 7.5 hours before the deliberation would resume, she transmitted the compiled document to Goraxol's diplomatic office. She did not send it to the full council. She was not permitted to address the full council. But she could send documents to delegates she had met with, under the Accord's standard liaison protocol, and she had met with Goraxol, and the protocol did not specify what kind of documents were appropriate. She then finally slept. 2 hours and 40 minutes. When she woke, there was a single-line acknowledgement from Goraxol's office in her queue. It said, "Document received. It will be entered into the deliberation record as Exhibit A, pending procedural review." She read that line several times. Pending procedural review was not acceptance. It was not even preliminary approval. But it meant someone had looked at it, and it meant the word exhibit had been used, which meant the mechanism existed to make it part of the formal record rather than a piece of informal correspondence, which meant it would be read, which was all she had ever actually needed. She made more coffee. She looked at the wall of her quarters, which was blank composite and told her nothing. She thought about her grandmother, who had rebuilt the storm wall 3 times, and who had never once, in all the years Vasquez Okafor had known her, described this as remarkable. Counselor Sathvarine had, in her 53 years of service to the Thar Collective's diplomatic apparatus, reviewed approximately 16,000 formal submissions, reports, proposals, assessments, and counterarguments. She had a system. She read executive summaries first, then methodology sections, then conclusions, then, only if something struck her as genuinely unresolved, the body of the work. She had never in her career found cause to revise this approach. She revised it now because the document Goraxol's assistant had forwarded to her at 7:30 with the notation, of potential interest, had no executive summary, no methodology section, and no conclusions. It simply began and then continued for 42 pages of plain descriptive text. She read the first 3 pages out of professional obligation and found them unsurprising. Infrastructure agreements, medical research outputs, the kind of cooperative institutional behavior that any mid-tier civilization produced at regular intervals. She was preparing to close the document and note it as received when something in the 4th page caused her to slow down. Was the detail. Not the content specifically, but the texture of the descriptions. The document noted, in reporting on the Senegal River Water Agreement, that the final text had been drafted 3 times from scratch after full collapses of the negotiation process, and that the parties had returned to the table each time without external mediation, without arbitration, and without a formal mechanism requiring them to do so. It noted this not as an achievement but as a sequence of events. It offered no analysis of why they had returned. It simply recorded that they had. Sathvarine was experienced enough to understand that the absence of explanation was itself an argument. The document was not telling her what to think about this pattern. It was presenting the pattern and leaving the interpretive work to her, which was either sophisticated rhetoric or complete naivete, and she was not certain which. She read further. The medical case she found unremarkable in itself. Medical advances were common in species at Earth's technological stage. What she found less dismissible was the footnote attached to it, a 2-sentence history of the research team's funding. The team had lost its primary institutional support in year 3 and year 6 of a 9-year project. Both times it had continued. This was not explained. There was no policy framework cited, no organizational mandate that would have compelled continuation. The document simply noted that they had continued and moved on. She pulled up the Accord's standard behavioral indices for reference. Under sustained resource scarcity, human cooperative structures showed a documented dissolution rate of approximately 63% within 18 months. This was one of the key data points Sathvarine had cited in her opening remarks. It was accurate. She was certain of it. What the index did not contain, she checked, was data on what happened to the other 37%. The index was organized around failure modes, as most behavioral risk indices were. It tracked what broke down and when and under what conditions. It did not track what rebuilt, because reconstruction was diffuse and slow and difficult to attribute, and the Accord survey instruments had not been designed to capture it. This was, Sathvarine recognized, an evidentiary gap. She was not pleased to recognize it, because she had cited the index as though it were complete, and it was not. She read the section on the long archive last. She read it twice. Dr. Anderson's interview quotation, because someone will, she read a 3rd time, and then set the document down on her workstation surface and sat with it for a while in the quiet of her quarters. The Thar Collective's civilization was old. Not the oldest in the Accord, that distinction belonged to the Pellucid Chorus, which had been a distributed entity for longer than most member species had been multicellular, but old enough that Sathvarine had sometimes found it difficult, in her professional life, to fully inhabit the perspective of younger civilizations. The Thar had resolved most of their existential coordination problems before the current era of interstellar contact. Their institutional memory was measured in geological cycles. The question of what to build for those who came after had, for the Thar, long since been answered by weight of tradition. She tried now to imagine what it would feel like to build for a future you could not see, within a civilization that had not yet stabilized, with resources that could be revoked, against problems that were not fully characterized. To do this not because tradition compelled it, but because, the only explanation the document offered, because someone would eventually be there to need it. She could not entirely inhabit that imagination. But she could recognize it as something other than what she had described in the chamber as primitive stress response behavior. At 9 o'clock she sent a message to Goraxol. It said, I would like to discuss the evidentiary record before we reconvene. He replied within 4 minutes, I was hoping you would say that. They met in a small conference room near the station's administrative ring, a neutral space, neither of their offices, which was the THAR convention for conversations where neither party wished to hold positional advantage. Sathvareen came alone. Gorak Sol brought his policy assistant, a young Rem named Varikli, who took notes and said nothing. The conversation lasted 90 minutes. Most of it was technical, a detailed analysis of the gaps in the Accord's behavioral index, a discussion of what additional data collection would be required to properly characterize human recovery patterns, a preliminary conversation about whether the existing evidentiary standard for Category 3 classification was methodologically sound given those gaps. It was outwardly a procedural conversation between two experienced diplomats reviewing the quality of their own evidence. At the end of it, Sathvareen said, I am not prepared to change my vote. Gorak Sol said, I am not asking you to. Pause. What are you asking? I am asking whether, given the identified gaps in the evidentiary record, you believe the current standard of evidence is sufficient for a decision of this permanence. Sathvareen's gill plates shifted, amber deepening briefly toward something that was not quite orange. She said, that is a different question. Yes, Gorak Sol said. It is. He reconvened session at 14:07 opened differently than most council sessions Gorak Sol had attended in his career. Usually there was a quality of settled momentum to a resumed deliberation. The delegates had thought their thoughts, the positions had calcified, and the business of the session was to confirm what everyone already knew was going to happen. Today the chamber felt less settled. He was not certain whether this was something he could observe or something he was projecting, but 40 years of reading rooms had given him a reasonable calibration, and his calibration said, this is not yet finished. Sathvareen had not changed her vote. She had been precise about this in their conversation, and she was not a delegate who used words loosely. But she had agreed, when Gorak Sol filed a procedural request under Article 14 of the Charter, the provision allowing for new evidence to be entered during a bounded adjournment, not to formally object to its admission. This was less than support and more than nothing. In council dynamics, it was sufficient. The exhibit Gorak Sol submitted was not Vasquez Okafor's compilation document. That had been entered into the record as a reference item, accessible to any delegate who wished to read it, but he did not present it as his primary argument. He had decided, after the conversation with Sathvareen, that the most compelling thing he could show the council was not new data. The most compelling thing was something already in their existing files that they had, for understandable reasons, read wrong. He had spent the late night hours reviewing the Accord's complete surveillance archive on humanity, every anthropological survey, every behavioral study, every incident report, every cross-referenced analysis that the Accord's Observer Corps had compiled over the past 2 centuries of intermittent contact. It was a formidable body of work. The Accord took documentation seriously, and the file on humanity was among the most extensive for any pre-contact species in the database. He had found what he was looking for in a set of incident reports filed 40 years earlier, during the period following humanity's first major climate displacement events. The reports catalogued in careful detail the cascading institutional failures that the events had produced, the economic disruption, the displacement crises, the political fragmentation, the resource conflicts in 3 regions that had briefly escalated to what the Accord's observers had classified as subthreshold armed engagement. It was the kind of report that supported exactly the analysis Sathvareen had presented, a species under environmental stress exhibiting predictable dissolution behaviors. But the incident reports were filed at 6-month intervals, and Gorak Sol had read all of them, not just the peak crisis entries that the summary analysis cited. The reports from the period 18 months after peak crisis showed something the summary had not emphasized: the institutional reconstruction rate. Not recovery to pre-crisis baseline, that took longer and in some cases never completed, but the active process of rebuilding, the rate at which humans in the aftermath of each major failure point had begun constructing new systems, often before the old systems had fully collapsed. The rate was, by any comparative metric Gorak Sol could apply, anomalous. He had reviewed similar crisis period data for 6 other species in the Accord's files. Species at comparable technological stages, facing environmental pressures of comparable scale. In every case, the post-crisis institutional rebuilding process was slower, more dependent on external coordination, and more likely to produce facsimiles of the destroyed systems rather than novel alternatives. Humans, the data showed, had a documented tendency to use crisis as a design input. They built back differently on average. Not always better and not without enormous cost but differently, incorporating the failure into the architecture of the replacement. This was not a small finding. It was, in Goraxol's considered judgment, the central finding about human civilization that the Accord summary analysis had not captured, because it required looking at the data across time rather than at a single point, and because the standard analytical framework for pre-contact species behavioral assessment was not designed to weight recovery rates as heavily as crisis response rates. He presented this to the chamber in 40 minutes, with primary sources cited and comparative tables displayed on the chamber's projection surface. He spoke carefully without editorial commentary, allowing the data to present its own argument. He was not, he said at the outset, presenting a case for membership. He was presenting a case that the Council's existing model of human behavior was missing a significant variable, and that a classification decision of this consequence should not be made from an incomplete model. The pellucid chorus, which had abstained on the main motion and had not spoken substantively since the session opened, spoke now. Its translated voice said, "We have a question about the anomalous recovery rate. Our analysis of the data suggests it may be correlated with something in the human memory architecture, specifically the episodic memory system's role in constructing counterfactual models. We would like to understand this better before rendering a final position." Goraxol said he believed that question could be addressed with adequate time and appropriate expertise, and that he would suggest the formation of a joint working group with that mandate. The delegate from the Siluan technocracy said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "The recovery rate is interesting. I do not think it changes the fundamental assessment of institutional stability." "Perhaps not," Goraxol said. "But I would submit that if the recovery rate has been systematically underweight, our assessment of institutional stability may itself be incomplete." Another silence. The chamber air recyclers continued their precise hum. Someone's implant clicked. Goraxol waited. He was good at waiting. The REM were, by evolutionary history, ambush hunters who had spent millions of years learning patience as a survival strategy, and while Goraxol was a diplomat rather than a hunter, the waiting capability had transferred. At the far end of the table, Sathvarine's gill plates had shifted to the faint orange he had noted that morning. She was still. She was, he suspected, doing what very experienced diplomats did when a piece of evidence had moved them without yet fully moving their position. She was looking for the version of the existing framework that could accommodate the new information without requiring her to formally reverse a concluded analysis. He did not need her to reverse it. He needed her to want more time. He needed her to say, in whatever formal language was available to her, that the question was not finished. The vote she cast after that could be whatever she believed it should be. But a vote taken from an incomplete model was not justice, and Sathvarine of the Thar Collective was, whatever her conclusions, a delegate who cared about that distinction. He believed this. He had believed it before the adjournment, when he had voted against the original motion with no certainty that it would matter. He believed it now, watching her be still at the end of the table, while the question of 8 billion people waited in the sealed room with them, patient as old stone. HFY called for a recess at 1540. This was itself unusual. She almost never called for recesses once deliberation had resumed, holding to the Thar professional preference for sustained focus over interrupted process. The other delegates accepted without comment. The chamber cleared. Goraxol stepped into the corridor outside, and Vasquez Okafor, watching from the anteroom, watched him stand with his hands folded behind his back and look at nothing in particular for 7 minutes, which was the kind of waiting she had come to associate with people who were very good at their work and knew that their part of it was done. She did not know what was happening. She had not been in the chamber. She had watched through the composite panel, reading posture and gesture the way she had learned to read it over years of working in contexts where she understood the words but not the nuances, and what she had read was, something shifted. She could not characterize it more precisely than that. Something in the chamber had moved, and the room had settled differently afterward, and now Sathvarine was alone inside it, and the other delegates were in the corridor, and whatever was about to happen had not happened yet. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When the delegates reconvened, Sathvarine spoke first. She spoke for 11 minutes, and Vasquez Okafor's translation implant rendered it in real time, and she listened to every word with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting for a long time and intends not to miss anything now that it is finally arriving. Sathvarine did not apologize, retract, or concede. She was not built for those gestures and they would not have been appropriate in any case. What she said was this, that the evidentiary record as it currently stood was insufficient to support a permanent and irrevocable classification, that the working methodology of the behavioral index had a documented gap that warranted formal review, and that she was prepared to support a revised motion in place of the original, provided the revised motion met specific conditions that she then outlined in careful, formal language. The conditions were three. First, the Category 3 classification motion to be tabled for a review period of not less than 10 years, during which an expanded observation protocol would be designed and implemented to capture recovery rate data alongside crisis response data. Second, humanity's application for co-governance of the Kepler relay to be placed in a provisional status, neither approved nor denied, while the new evidentiary framework was developed. Third, Ambassador Vasquez Okafor's compiled document to be formally entered into the deliberation record as a methodological critique rather than a testimonial submission, which would give it greater procedural standing and require it to be addressed in any future assessment. This was, Vasquez Okafor understood, not a victory. Not in the sense she had imagined victory when she had first been given this assignment, when victory had looked like full membership and immediate approval and the relief of an outcome she had been terrified of failing to achieve. This was something less than that. The quarantine was not lifted. The Kepler relay application was not approved. The assessment of humanity as a species still under evaluation, still being watched, still being measured, still being judged, remained entirely in place. But the judgment was no longer final. And the framework of judgment was being revised. And her document, her 42 pages of ordinary things that had happened on an ordinary day, was going to be part of the formal record that any future council would have to contend with before they could classify humanity as unfit. The revised motion was presented by Gorak Sol and seconded by the Pellucid Chorus, which expressed, through its translated voice, what it described as substantial interest in the episodic memory question and a desire to pursue it further. The vote on the revised motion was 5 in favor, 1 against. The Siluan technocracy delegate, who stated for the record that she found the procedural revision premature, and 1 abstention from a delegate who had been largely silent throughout and whose position Vasquez Okafor had never been able to clearly read. 5 in favor was a supermajority. The motion passed. The chamber recorder announced the outcome and began the documentation sequence. Gorak Sol turned toward the anteroom panel, not fully, not in a way that could be recorded as a directed communication, but enough, and Vasquez Okafor, from her side of the composite, nodded once. She walked back to her quarters. She sat down. She had a protocol to file, a report to transmit, a long list of procedural items that needed to happen in the next 6 hours before she slept. She sat for a while before starting any of them, not because she was overwhelmed but because she had learned, over years of emergency medicine and diplomatic work, that there was a particular kind of exhaustion that came not from failure but from the sustained effort of preventing one, and that exhaustion needed to be acknowledged before it could be set down. She thought about the long archive. Dr. Anderson, in his desert facility, had spent 20 years building toward something he would not see completed. She had spent 14 months building toward something that had not, in the end, been completed either, not the way she'd imagined it. But the record would persist. The evidentiary gap was now officially named. The framework would be revised, and someone would do that revision, and someone after them would apply it, and decades from now the council would deliberate again with a methodology that accounted for the thing that Sathvarine, to her credit, had been willing to admit she had missed. Someone would be there to need it. So she had done the work. She transmitted the preliminary outcome report to Earth at 1650 station time. Due to signal travel, it would arrive in approximately 4.3 light-years worth of time, and the people waiting for it would read the result and understand, she hoped, what it meant and also what it didn't mean, and then they would get up and go back to the business of being the kind of species that built seawalls and coral reefs and spinal scaffolding and archives for a future they were not guaranteed to see. She trusted them to do that. She had, in 47 years, found very little more reliable to trust. 11 years after the Vela Station adjournment, a revised version of the Accord's Behavioral Assessment Index was submitted for ratification by a joint working group composed of delegates from 7 member civilizations and 3 external consultants, one of whom was human. The revised index contained 31 methodological modifications. The most significant was a new analytical category designated recovery architecture, a set of metrics designed to capture the rate, diversity, and novelty of institutional reconstruction following stress events in observed civilizations. The category had been named by a Pellucid Chorus researcher who had spent a decade studying episodic memory structures in non-collective species, and who had concluded, in a paper that was cited 43 times before peer review was completed, that the most diagnostic indicator of long-term civilizational viability was not how a species behaved when things were stable but what they built in the wreckage. The paper cited Exhibit A of the Vela Station deliberation record 17 times. Rin Vasquez Okafor retired from the diplomatic service at 58, 11 years after Vela Station, 14 months after the revised index was ratified. Her retirement remarks at the Bureau were brief. She had never been comfortable with ceremonies, and contained no mention of the station or the vote or the document or any of the things that her colleagues in the years between had occasionally tried to make into a larger story than she felt they were. She said that she had been fortunate to do work she believed in, and that she hoped the people continuing it would find reasons to believe in it too, and that was all. She moved to a small house in what had once been the outermost ring of coastal Lagos, now 15 meters above what used to be the waterline. Her grandmother's storm wall was gone. The whole neighborhood had been moved inland when she was in her 20s, but the road that ran past the old site was still called the same name it had always been called, after a woman who had been a schoolteacher and had organized the original wall-building collective in 1987 and had never, by any account, considered this remarkable. She grew vegetables in the garden and read extensively and occasionally answered correspondence from younger diplomats who had questions she could sometimes help with. Once a year, reliably, she received a message from Gorak Sol of the REM, who had also retired, and who wrote long, discursive letters about the state of the Accord and about his grandchildren and about a gardening project he had started that he described, with characteristic precision, as an attempt to understand patients empirically rather than theoretically. She wrote back. Their correspondence had, by the time of her death at 91, accumulated to enough material to constitute a small and rather unusual diplomatic archive, which her family donated to the Long Archive Project at Atacama, because she had noted in a letter written 6 months before she died that she thought they would take good care of it. Dr. Anderson's project had, by then, been running for 40 years. He had died of cardiac failure at 82, 17 years after the Vela Station deliberation, and had been succeeded as project lead by one of his former graduate students, who had been succeeded in turn by a systems architect from Nairobi who was 34 when she took the position and who intended, she said, to spend the next 30 years learning what there was to know about how to keep things intact for people who didn't exist yet. The Kepler Relay Co-Governance application had been formally approved 9 years after Vela Station, following 2 additional observation cycles conducted under the revised index. The approval had been 4 votes in favor, 2 against, 1 abstention. Sathvareen of the Thar had cast a vote in favor. She had not communicated this decision in advance to anyone, and she had not, in the years following, spoken publicly about it. Gorak Sol mentioned it once in a letter to Vasquez Okafor, and noted only that Sathvareen had provided a brief rationale for the record, that the recovery architecture data from the second observation cycle had been sufficient to resolve the evidentiary gap she had originally identified, and that she had voted accordingly. Vasquez Okafor had written back, "Tell her I'm glad. If you ever speak to her." Gorak Sol had written, "She knows." The broader accord, in the decades following, found the revised behavioral index useful in ways the working group had not entirely anticipated. The recovery architecture category proved applicable not just to humanity but to several other species under observation, and produced results that complicated a number of long-standing assessments that had seemed settled. 2 civilizations that had been classified as Category 2 stable were downgraded on the basis that their recovery rates were slower than the index had previously captured. One civilization that had been on a Category 3 recommendation for 6 years was retained in provisional status after the new metrics suggested its post-crisis institutional diversity was significantly higher than the crisis period data alone indicated. None of this was straightforward. The index was a tool, not an answer. The Council still made its decisions by vote, and the votes were still contested, and the questions they were trying to answer were still, at their core, the kind that did not resolve cleanly into data. What does it mean for a civilization to be ready? What constitutes sufficient evidence that a species, with all its volatility and irrationality and self-destructive capacity, can be trusted with a larger role in the ordered machinery of the galaxy? These were not, and had never been, empirical questions with empirical answers. But they were questions that could be asked better or worse. They could be asked from a more complete picture of what the evidence contained, or from a less complete one. They could be asked with a methodology that acknowledged the limits of what it measured, or with one that treated those limits as invisible. And the direction they pushed in, toward more complete, toward more honest, toward a framework that counted what survived alongside what collapsed, was, Gorak Sol had come to believe, a direction worth spending a career on. He finished the thought in the last letter he ever wrote to Vasquez Okafor, 3 weeks before her death at 91. He wrote, "I have been thinking about what the whole thing was in the end. Not the vote. The 24 hours. I think it was an argument about what kind of evidence we were willing to look at. You made us look at something we hadn't. That is, in my experience, almost everything that is ever required. She read it the morning it arrived in her garden in Lagos, where the vegetables were coming in and the air smelled of red clay and the ocean was visible on clear days from the upper window of the house, blue and very far away and permanent as anything she knew. She read it twice. She thought about writing back and decided what she wanted to say was short enough that she could hold it instead. Almost everything. Yes. She had always thought so too.